Yeah, I had a comment for Dr. Legrice and two questions, please. First of all, I'm Michael Houghton, University of Alberta. I really found your talk incredibly valuable and useful, and also the recent editorial from Robin Weiss. I think both you and him are urging a lot of caution in the interpretation of the recent data associating XMRV with chronic fatigue, and also what it means with these two other groups associating the murine leukemia virus with chronic fatigue. So your point's well taken, and I think a lot of caution has to be used in making conclusions about this field. So thank you for that. But my two questions were, first of all, around the serodiagnosis of XMRV infection. Seems to me that with the situation of endogenous retroviruses, if anything, there's even a greater chance of cross-reaction with serologic tests than there is with PCR tests, where you can use specific primers. So I'd like you to comment on that, please. What role are the endogenous retroviruses going to play in serologic tests designed specifically to detect XMRV? And secondly, if we ever do get to the point where we want to treat patients in a controlled fashion, placebo-controlled clinical trial of XMRV patients, if we ever do get to that point, the recent paper from Singe and Ray Sanuzzi pointed out that there are two integrase inhibitors that are active in cell culture. And surprisingly, they do act in synergy. You wouldn't have predicted that for the same target. And then there's tenofovir and ZDV also. And amongst those drugs, there is a good deal of synergistic activity. So I guess my question is, maybe the cupboard, the therapeutic cupboard, is not as bare as we might think initially because of these synergistic interactions between these drugs. So I'd like to ask you to comment on that, please.
The answer to your first question, this is why we're developing both nucleic acid or nucleic acid serodiagnosis and virus culture. And so then it comes down to what is our first line diagnosis, how we start sieving. And clearly things from a serodiagnosis perspective, it's quite possible you could be looking at a protein from another virus. But I think one of the points we made earlier with these new assays, the XFCA and the XSGA, these can, with close to 100% accuracy, rule out a contaminating virus. And so I think this is one point of the meeting. As I said, there was one presentation on the prevalence of XMRV that was criticized that it was only nucleic acid diagnosis. There has to be at least a two-pronged nucleic acid diagnosis, serodiagnosis. If possible, if we've sieved enough, then to do virus culture. So that would be my answer to number one. To number two, it comes down to the points that Nancy discussed a few minutes back, that once we have good biomarkers, once we know what we're measuring, there's no reason we should not consider a small-scale clinical trial. But we need to know what to measure, and we need to know what to measure it with. And I think what we're asking for, I've been following this since the almost infamous meeting of July the 7th, 2009 that I put together. I think the scientific community, we're simply asking for a bit more time to validate the assays that we've been put together. I've been working on this since September 2009. And that was when, within the NCI, we essentially got the green light to go ahead with a multi-pronged approach to viral diagnostics. So we've actually been working for quite a short time. These assays are time-consuming. We'd like everything to work first time. Occasionally, we have a little bump in the road and we have to back up. We will be there soon. And I think we will have the biomarkers, as Nancy said. We will have the biomarkers that we want to measure, and we will have the assays that we can measure. The antivirals, my philosophy has been more along the HIV lines to hit as many targets as possible. And as much as tenofovir and AZT work, the non-nucleosides don't work, 3TC doesn't work. I would like to see something against the protease. The first line HIV antiretrovirals or protease inhibitors, at least 2 RT inhibitors, and the integrase inhibitors come up most cases in a salvage therapy. It's very interesting with HIV, because, with XMRV, because the easiest thing to do, as I said, was you go to the cupboard and you open the drawers of protease inhibitors and RT inhibitors and so on. We shouldn't forget that with HIV, we're now the 3rd generation inhibitors that have been so tailor-made. And these are really very finely honed square rods to go into square holes. And we're at the stage of smart drug development. And actually, when you think about it with XMRV, we may want to back up at least 2 generations and go back to the things that were really not so good against HIV. As I said, we're into smart drug discovery. And if we're smart, we might want to back up and say, hey, maybe one of the bottom drawers that may have something there. But I think we're not far from a controlled clinical trial.
Can I just follow up on that? With HIV, there's such a massive replicative cycle going on. What, 10 to the 9th new virions per day, and the amino acid mutation rate, but you can escape any one thing in 4 hours. With this virus, presumably we're talking about a much lower viral load, a much lower replicative rate. Why wouldn't one drug be good enough? Why wouldn't being able to, if they're not going to escape, if you took a drug that took 2 or 3 mutations to escape it, not AZT, but something else, maybe the integrase, because it takes more than one, why wouldn't one drug be good enough in a setting like that?
I don't have a good answer to that. I would prefer more than one drug. It's not the best answer that you want to hear.
Because the problem is the other drugs are toxic, and these patients already have mitochondrial dysfunction, and that's the toxicity of AZT, is mitochondrial dysfunction. So I kind of hate the idea of throwing AZT onto a chronic fatigue population. I think it could be kind of, there'd be more adverse outcomes in this population than in HIV.
And I also think we have to be a little bit cautious there, because as I said earlier, the success with HIV is because it's a virus that replicates very rapidly. And if XMRV does not replicate very rapidly, that some of the antivirals may not be as effective as we had hoped.